Okay, now, recording. The final exam is next week at 10 o'clock, regular class time. So 10 till 12:30. And you will, in this class, will have to finish at 12:30 because I have another final exam to administer at 1 o'clock. So we have to finish at 12:45. Excuse me. Excuse me. It should not take that long, folks. Okay. All right. Now, what I want to make clear on the final, and again, regrettably, the persons who need to hear this might not be here to hear it. Half of the final will be on today's lecture. The other half will be comprehensive. Now, I had a situation where, that's on the syllabus. Hopefully all of you have seen the syllabus. If not, you're hearing it now. I had a student last fall who did not know that. And he wound up changing an A to a B because he made a 45 on a final exam. Hope that doesn't happen to any of you, but it lowered his grade from an A to a B, and he wanted me to raise it, and I said, I just can't be fair to you and anyone else, but let this be a lesson to you. But anyway, half of it's going to be on today's lecture, and the other half will be chapters 1 to 11. And it's going to be basic stuff. I'm not going to ask you who Shoot Williams' father was, especially since I don't even know. Or who Julius Caesar's wife was. Nothing like that. Just basic stuff.
Can you give us like an example or two?
Well, it'd be similar. It'd be similar to what you've been taking all semester. I might have put down Caesar Augustus, and you tell me what you know about Caesar Augustus. What I want for that, you'd have to say Roman. If you don't say Roman, I'm going to knock at least a point off. You have to say Roman emperor. Then you might say the one who was emperor when Christ was born, or something about him. And another example would be like, Euphrates River. You must say it's in Mesopotamia. Or you must say Mesopotamia. Otherwise, I'll kind of point out, there's some questions that don't have a location, a few, like primogeniture, inheritance by the firstborn. You don't have to go, but Confucianism, you have to put China for Confucianism. You have to. Okay, does that answer basically? Now, I have not made it out yet, but I'm going to get to work on that. Now, don't look for the test you take today. Don't look for the results till tomorrow. I won't be able to grade them tonight, or likely not, because it takes me hours to get these lectures ready to go online. In fact, I have to do it while asleep. It takes 5 hours to convert these lectures for both classes into MP4. And I do that while asleep, then get up in the morning, and the first thing I do is get that online. Then I start grading. And by the time I get home, I'm too tired to grade, so don't expect me to grade tonight. It's just, I get home exhausted. I'm not as young as I was 30 years ago, folk. Someday you'll maybe understand. All right, anybody have any questions? Okay, we got a lot of ground to cover. Let's get started. Okay, Roman Empire. We're back to European history. And again, what you saw, hopefully now, folks, you're going to notice when you take today's test, that the way I made up today's test, those of you who are here on time heard this, the way today's test, I looked on my screen, movie screen, and saw what I wrote on the board, and I just wrote, copied from the board, and that's what you're going to see on today's test. For the final exam, I plan to do a lot of the same thing. What you see right here and what I'm going to write for the next 2 hours, you can expect to see on the final exam. So, again, those of you who are late, I'm sorry you missed it. No, I'm not sorry. Hey, I got here before 7 o'clock this morning. So,
Quick question before we start about the final exam. I know you haven't made it yet, but is it going to be multiple choice, or is it going to be like a name and then you write about it?
yeah, I'll put a name or a place, and you'd write about it.
Are you going to have word bank at all, or not?
A what?
A word bank like we have sometimes on the back?
Oh, I haven't made it up yet. I probably will. I probably will. And basically be almost a glorified matching test. But the biggest matching test you ever took. You'll know what I mean within a couple of hours when you see today's test. Okay, leaving that. Now, the Roman Empire was on its last legs when we left it. And there were some people coming in from, these are German people. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Saxons, the Angles. There actually were quite a few more. I'm naming the big ones. The Visigoths and Ostrogoths were both Goths. The Ostrogoths, and I've got to be able to find my marker. If I don't find that, I'm going to really be lost. So here's one. Here's one. All right, the Ostrogoths went to Italy, and the Visigoths went to Spain. Now, here's the thing about the Ostrogoth population. Now, they took over and so absorbed the Roman population that the Romans ceased to exist. The Latin language was replaced by the Italian language. Now granted, these people who moved in, they copied some words from Latin, and the Italian language, I mean, if you know Italian, you can fairly easily learn Latin. Or if you learn Latin, you can fairly easily learn Italian, but they are different. If you know Latin, you cannot understand Italian without training. Or if you grew up in Italy, you cannot understand Latin without training. Now, and they changed Italy from an advanced civilization to a semi-barbaric, almost uncivilized people. Now, folk, I'm going to say something here that I've not said quite before. I do believe this could apply to 21st century Western civilization, particularly not only the United States but Europe. Europe has let a lot of people in. They are taking over. They are setting up what you call safe zones where not the police and fire are not allowed in. And rumor has it the same thing is going on here. Pardon me, I do have a little bit of cold. If you have, but the same thing is going on here. And what I'm getting at is, if we let enough of these people in, they could completely change American civilization to where English would not even be the spoken language anymore. If that doesn't bother you, they also would bring their own values in, which are not ours, and basically we could become a semi-civilized or even an uncivilized country. All right, if any of you have any comments, you're welcome to say them. I mean, I keep reading in the papers and hearing that we should build bridges instead of walls. The Romans built bridges, let these people in. They destroyed the Roman civilization. The Chinese built walls. China survived. They built a big wall. They survived the barbarian onslaught. The Romans did not. All right, but now here comes a group of people. These are not German. The Huns came in from Central Asia, led by Attila the Hun, who I've talked about. And again, it's hard for us to imagine because we've not experienced this in generations. The Roman officials heard a rumor that there was a vast horde of people with untold amount of horses and mules and other animals coming in. So the Romans went to investigate. Stood on a high hill and overlooked, and as far as they could see, there were these hordes of men, women, and children, old people, young people, people of all ages. The Huns had been forced out of Mongolia because what happened in Mongolia many a time over was Mongolia is a half desert, not completely, the half desert, and there's only so many people it can hold, so many animals can feed. When the people become too numerous, they have to leave. We've had wave after wave of Mongolians who have left. Among them the Finns, the Magyars, the Huns, the Bulgars, and finally the Turks, and the Mongols themselves, led by Genghis Khan. These people have come in at different times throughout history, coming in waves. Attila the Hun nearly destroyed Roman civilization. He finally was defeated, but the Huns settled here in what is called Hungary. Now, and when I was in graduate school, I read a book about him, and a few of my classmates read the same book. The author concluded that Attila the Hun did nobody any good at all. He was thoroughly, totally evil. There was nothing good that could be said about him. And he pointed out what others had said that was good about him. He might have done this and that. He actually, so far as we can tell, did nobody any good whatsoever. Thoroughly evil. Attila the Hun. Again, he believed that God had called him to come in and scourge Western civilization. It took a combine, the Germans and Romans got together. They defeated him, and they would have wiped him out, except that the Roman general decided, hey, I want him on my side. So the Roman general opened up a hole in his line. He had him surrounded. Opened up a hole to where the Huns could escape. He hoped to use the Huns on his side to take care of the Germans. It was the only way the Romans could win. Now, I want to say this. In the case of the Romans, if they had not killed a high percentage of their babies after they were born, they practiced putting babies out and exposing them and letting them be devoured by wild animals. If they had not done this, the Romans would have had enough manpower to have defeated their enemies. I'm convinced of that. But they killed a high percentage, and also, well, the Roman women were practicing abortion. Yes, they had abortion back then, infanticide and birth control, and mostly they were not getting married either. Not only was divorce common, but they had a whole lot of women who did and men who did not get married at all. The result was a huge population decrease from probably, let's see, 50 million to 30 million. That's a big decrease, folks. And it would have made a difference. I'm strongly convinced the Romans would have defeated both the Germans and the Huns. In fact, I don't think the Huns would have taken them on. I mean, when these Huns, they were forced out of Mongolia. All right, and they could, I believe they'd have settled down immediately and not taken on and destroyed the Roman cities if they would have realized, hey, they're too powerful for us. We can't win. Let's leave and fight them. Instead, they fought them and thought they could win. And they might have had not the Romans and Germans gotten together. All right, so much for that for the moment. But anyway, Europe was highly threatened. Europe went into a period that has been known as the Dark Ages. Learning somewhat died out, not completely, but schools were few and far between. Scholars were few and far between. Written records are few. And we have a hard time finding out what went on during this period called the Dark Ages. But one thing we know for certain about this period of time, let's see, the Franks. The word France comes from Franks. The word Franks means the free people. The Franks were a Germanic tribe also. They settled in what is today France, and they somewhat replaced the original Gallic population, the Gauls. Clovis was one of their kings. Now, there were several powerful kings of the Franks at first, but Clovis was the most important. He's remembered for one thing because he was powerful, but also he was the first king to convert to Roman Catholicism. Now, as I've mentioned, Constantine was the first Christian emperor. But Constantine moved over here to Constantinople. Clovis converted, like Constantine was converted to Arian Christianity, not Roman Catholic. He was not a Roman Catholic, but he was Arian. There was a difference. You don't hear about Arianism today. Arianism died down. I'm not going to go into the theological difference between Arius and Rome. But Arianism is followers of a man named Arius. But anyway, this helped greatly enhance the Roman Catholic Church because they had a king. And of course, if you wonder, well, why did Clovis convert? Well, for one thing, his wife was already a Christian. His prime minister was Christian. More than half his army was Christian. More than half his army officers were Christian. And it was just like his people were going into Christianity right and left, and finally he joined in, and he became converted also. He was baptized in the Roman Catholic faith. And from him on out, every one of your kings of Europe practically were Christian. I mean, at least every one of your kings of France and Italy were Christian. Now, the threat to the Europeans was not over. And by the way, I'm not going to mention that Clovis was of the Merovingian dynasty, and you may know the Merovingians have made news in modern times with the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, if any of you are familiar with it. Many of you know what I'm talking about, the Merovingian conspiracies. Okay, I won't go into it. But basically, anyway, he was a Merovingian, but I'm not going to. But remember Clovis's name. He first converted to Roman Catholic Christianity. Now, shortly after his time, there was a famous pope. Now, I was asked once how the pope becomes so powerful. You don't find another office like the office of pope anywhere else in history, except here in Western Europe. In order to have an office of pope, you have to have something starting with a political unity. In other words, Roman Empire. Then the political unity has to fragment, with the pope still remaining strong. So basically, that's what you had. The pope set up his headquarters in Rome and claimed that he was head of the whole church, a claim that was not always recognized. But then when the emperor moved to Constantinople, this meant that the pope was the strong man of the hour. The church began to take on more and more functions that were once done by the state. And for instance, something that's still done most of the time. You know, people wanted to marry. They used to go to the state to get a license. Well, today, if you want to marry, you still go to the state to get a license. But a lot of people have a wedding in a church and don't consider themselves married until they've had a church wedding. Again, the church took on the function that was once done by the state. Your marriage was not valid unless it was approved by the church. This was to go on for the next, 1,600 or so years, and still goes on to this day. But we remember Pope Gregory. He is sometimes called the first pope. Before him, the bishops of Rome. Now, I want to say the pope's original title was Bishop of Rome. And our present pope, when he became pope back in 2013, he announced, well, I don't ever want to forget that I'm first and foremost Bishop of Rome. And I'm not pope of the whole church, I'm Bishop of Rome. And anyone can decide what he meant, but the pope is still the Bishop of Rome. But anyway, Pope Gregory, he gave us the Gregorian calendar, which we still use. Very important, because before his time, we were using the calendar built by Julius Caesar, the Julian calendar. Well, the Julian calendar was found to be off. What was happening after 500 years to 600 years of the Julian calendar, your solstices and your equinoxes were not occurring when they were supposed to. Now, why is that important? Okay, the Gregorian calendar adds a leap year to the calendar every 4 years. So what if it didn't? I had a fourth grade teacher who didn't know that. Well, if there weren't that leap year added, we would lose 24 days a century. You notice it said 24, not 25, because most of the time at the end of a century, it's not a leap year. Like the years 1700, 1800, 1900 were not leap years, but 2000 was. In other words, if the year is divisible by 400, it's a leap year. So 1600 was a leap year, 800 was a leap year, 1200 was a leap year, 2000 was a leap year. But 2100 will not be a leap year. Now, if we did not, pretty soon we'd be singing, like in about 5 or 6 minutes, we'd sing, I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, when the temperature outside would be 90 degrees. In other words, the solstices and equinoxes would be off. The idea of we got to keep the solstices and equinoxes occurring at the same time every year, or approximately the same time. We just had a summer solstice. What does summer solstice mean? That's where the sun got as far north as it's going to get. Then it starts heading south again. So today is July 20th. The sun has been heading south since June 21st. We don't notice it much yet, but we will. Now, come September 21st, September 22nd now, it's not the 20th, the sun will cross the equator. That's called the fall equinox. Sun across the equator and its way south. Then on December 21st, the sun gets as far south as it's going to get and starts heading north. But you want to keep those solstice equinoxes occurring on the same calendar day as much as possible. If you don't, we'll be singing I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas again when the temperature outside is 90 degrees. And we'll be having snow falling in July. Anyway, the Gregorian calendar is expected to last 10,000 years before they have to add a day or subtract a day from it sometime 10,000 years down the road. Best calendar we've ever come up with. Now, also, he helped the poor, and I'm not going to fault him for it. He was, after all, a churchman, not a statesman. But he helped the poor. He sent missionaries to try to convert, among other people, the Irish and the Scandinavians. He sent missionaries up here and throughout Ireland and into Scotland. And again, like I say, he helped the poor. It has been said that if every pope had been like Pope Gregory, there would have been no Protestant Reformation. There would have been no split between the Orthodox Catholic and the Roman Catholic. The church would still be united under Rome if every pope would have been like Pope Gregory. But unfortunately, every pope was not as good a man as he was. He's one of the two, maybe the only pope they call the Great. I don't know if there's another one or not, but he's got the title of the Great. All right. He also set up numerous monasteries, in which I want to talk about monastery. The monasteries were set up, and they were like the hospital, the library, the town meeting hall, all rolled into one. They were the intellectual center and perhaps the social center of the time. Inside the monasteries lived the monks. The monks promised never to marry. 3 vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. I'm not going to write those down. I'm skipping a lot. But anyway, the monks lived in monasteries, and the monks would copy old documents. They copied Socrates wrote nothing about it. They copied Plato. They copied Aristotle. They copied the Bible. And they copied Cicero. And they copied Livy. So they did a lot that kept learning alive during the Middle Ages, such as it was. The monks also did a lot to help the poor, care for the sick, devoted themselves to a lot of good deeds. They were the intellectual center of the Middle Ages. Now, time went on. Eventually, Europe found itself hemmed in. From Central Asia came the Bulgars and the Magyars. Again, they came from Mongolia, again, or the area around Mongolia. And then from North Africa came the Muslims. The Muslims had conquered North Africa. They went in and occupied Sicily. They did not keep Sicily permanently. And they would occupy Spain for some 700 or 800 years. I mean, not all of it. They conquered part of Spain. Now, the problem with Spain has been said it's a land that devours its armies. The Muslims, who could fight really well in this open desert-like terrain where they could swoop down with a cavalry and hack an enemy army to pieces, got to Spain. They found hills and mountains and bushes and brush and undergrowth and trees aplenty, and you can't fight with mounted cavalry very well under those conditions. So they never took all of Spain, but they took a lot of it. Eventually, the Spanish drove them out. The 2 Spanish kings that drove them out finally were King Ferdinand and his wife, Queen Isabella. The year was 1492, and once they'd done that, then Isabella could give Columbus 3 small ships, but that was something else. That's for the later chapter. But anyway, they got a lot of territory here. They started going into France. They were stopped in France at the Battle of Tours by Charles Martel. Charles Martel was, he was the prime minister. He was not the king of France. He was prime minister. They called him the mayor, or the big man in the palace. Now, here's what happened to why the king was not in charge. After King Clovis, and even before King Clovis's time, the Merovingian dynasty only married other Merovingians, believing their, we might say genes, but their term was blood, believing their blood to be superior to everybody else's blood. they would marry their cousins. And the result was they became feeble of mind and body. And a typical Merovingian would, he'd be born, the son of the king. His father would die when he was 6. His father would die young. So this boy would be crowned king at maybe 6 years old. He'd get married at about 14, live about 6 years, and die at 20. Die quite young. Again, because they were inbred. They were feeble of mind and body and unable to take the lead. So the mayor of the palace, or the big man of the palace, took over. So Charles Martel was the mayor of the palace, or otherwise the big man of the palace. He led, all right, when he heard that the Moors were arriving, were coming to France, France was in a bad state of unity. The Moors made havoc about here in the southern part of France. They thought, we're going to have an easy time. So they went on, but Charles Martel began to grab everyone who could handle a sword, every young man, and got them together. He disciplined them, he trained them, he molded them into an army. And he surprised the Moors. Now, here's what the Moors, it wasn't just that they couldn't handle bush, brush, and undergrowth. They also, when they met the Europeans, it was not like they'd had here. These kind of people over here were passive, didn't know how to fight well. The Europeans were fighters, fierce fighters, but also they lined up shoulder to shoulder, and they ran into a solid wall of shields and spears. The Moors, they ran into a solid wall of shields and spears, which they did not know how to handle. And they said, hey, we're used to fighting individuals and hacking them to pieces, and here, if we attack this solid wall, they're going to mow us down. You couldn't fight with one of them. You had to fight with a whole team. And the Moors couldn't handle this. The Moors is another word, by the way, for Muslims. They're also called Saracens. Anyway, Charles Martel stopped the Moors at the Battle of Tours. The Moors came back, but eventually Europe took the offensive. Now, okay, let me again. Europe was hemmed in. The Mongolian peoples coming from the east, the Muslims coming up from the south, and then from the north came a new group of people called the Vikings. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. The Vikings, for a time, the Danes conquered the English. And the Vikings should also remember something else they did. They went to Iceland, and then they went on farther from Iceland into Greenland. And they even went to Nova Scotia, and we now have found the place where they set up in Nova Scotia. When we found it was growing up in undergrowth and hard to find, completely covered over by brush and trees and whatever, but eventually it was found, and they built a structure out of stone. But the Vikings did go to Nova Scotia, and we have found Viking belt buckles as far west as Minnesota, indicating some of the Vikings might have gone deep into the United States. They could have gotten to Minnesota by going across the Great Lakes. If you know anything about the Great Lakes, you have to be careful when you get to Niagara Falls in a boat, because but otherwise, once you get past Niagara Falls, you can go from one lake to another, and they could have gotten as far as Minnesota. But anyway, but the American Indians eventually forced them out because the Indians greatly outnumbered them. But what they did to Europe, they spread terror to Europe. And the Europeans had a book, had a prayer in a prayer book, "From the fury of the north, may no Lord deliver us." This prayer was still found in the prayer books as late as the early 1800s, before the Europeans finally took it out. They were fearful of the Northmen. The Europeans, though, did not succumb to the Vikings or to the Magyars or the Muslims. Eventually, Europe took the aggressive and was able to deal with both of them. Now, here's the story, folk, in brief. Eventually, the Northmen became Christian. Some of them settled here in Italy, some of them settled here in Normandy. The word Normandy means Northmen. Some of them settled in places in England, but they converted to Christianity. The Magyars also, who came from Mongolia, they converted. But the Muslims have not yet converted to this day. Again, the Muslims, you may know,